Welcome back to MLL 400, the literature of travel in the 20th century, to what is already the last module of our class, the last stop on our journey. And this module is entitled In Search of the Real Japan, Donald Richie's travels along the inland sea. Now, we've come a long way. You might remember we started with Huang Zunxian, the Chinese intellectual who also traveled to Japan, right, in the late 19th century. We then followed Moriogai from Japan to Germany. We followed Hermann Hesse from Germany all the way to Malaya and Singapore. We followed Paul Morand on his travels to Catalonia. We then followed Yosano Akiko on her journey to Manchuria. We followed Langston Hughes on his journey from America to Berlin, onto the Soviet Union, and then into Central Asia. We followed Richie on his journey from China to Italy and France. We then, of course, followed Anna Segas on her protagonist's journey, travels from Germany to France, and from there on to Mexico. And today we are essentially, so to speak, returning to where we started this journey, and that is Japan. We are following Donald Richie from America to Japan. I quickly wanted to recap the objectives of this class. You might remember that we had set out on this journey to explore the act of traveling from a number of different perspectives. And I think we have experienced these different perspectives now. The travel for political and educational reasons, right? That was, of course, Huang Zunxian, really, right? What drove him. We had travelers motivated by romantic longing and exoticism, and we had seen that in Hermann Hesse, but, also in Paul Morand, also in Yosano Akiko. We had talked about travel in the context of colonialism, and yes, of course, again, Hermann Hesse, Yosano Akiko, all fall into that. We had talked about travel as exile, and of course Anna Segas had been our prime example. And of course we had also noticed that there is often overlap and the distinction is not quite as clear. And I think we will see the same in our last module, our module on Donald Richie. Huang Zunxian, right, goes to Japan in search of modernity, we had said. What is Donald Richie hoping to find in Japan? And what did he find? And of course, what do we hope to find? Us who went to Japan, would like to travel to Japan, for whom Japan is a desired destination. These are all questions we want to explore in this last module of ours. So here he is, Donald Richie, 1924 to 2013. On the left you have an image of the young Donald Richie. Donald Richie is a very influential film historian of Japanese cinema, but also a writer, cultural critic who lived most of his adult life in Japan, and most of his writing is about Japan. He first visited Japan with the American occupation forces following World War II. He went there in 1947, and on the left here you have an abridged collection of journal entries that span almost his entire sort of period in Japan, starting, as you can see, 1947. He becomes fascinated with Japanese culture, especially Japanese cinema, of which he became a lifelong promoter in America and the West, really. When he first went to Japan, he worked as a staff writer for the Pacific Stars and Stripes, which is a military newspaper, later for Japan Times, an English language newspaper in Japan. And again, he specialized on movie reviews of Japanese movies or movies in general, but also largely wrote sort of what we might call cultural criticism. He was really instrumental in introducing Japanese classic cinema to the rest of the world, especially the Western. If you're into Japanese cinema or cinema at all, you might have heard names like Kurosawa or Ozu or Gosho or Oshima. He served as curator for film at the New York Museum of Modern Art, 1969 to 1972. So again, you can see how his expertise in Japanese cinema really would have impacted the reception of Japanese cinema in America. Tom Wolfe, an American writer, called him the Lafcadio Hearn of our time. I hope you'll remember Lafcadio Hearn. I showed you a stamp, right, a Japanese stamp of him, right, that very important cultural figure, Irish-American, who was in Japan in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? So Tom Wolfe calls him the Lafcadio Hearn of our time, a subtle, stylish, deceptively lucid medium between two cultures that confuse one another, the Japanese and the American. Richie, when he first started to live in Japan, what sort of was the biggest draw for him was the far greater tolerance toward male homosexuality in Japan, as he was openly bisexual. Here are a few more images of him. We have Richie with Kurosawa and with Ozu, and then we have Richie just strolling through his neighborhood in Japan. Richie eventually became a Japanese citizen, and this is what he has to say about Tokyo. I think he was asked whether he felt like a tourist in Tokyo, and he says, "Tokyo is home. I know Tokyo better than any other city on earth. So why don't I feel that way about Tokyo? Well, it has to do with the fact that I live here. So what I've done is I've used up my tourist self in these other places, not in Tokyo." Now, the work that we are looking at today, our last work, is called The Inland Sea, which was first published in 1971, and which very much draws on multiple travels that Donald Richie undertook to the inland sea, and we'll look at a map in a minute. The book has pretty much stayed in print ever since, largely because it's been recognized as a classic of modern travel literature. It really is a very poetic travelogue about Richie's exploration of the islands of Japan's inland sea. And maybe we should look at the map first to show you where the inland sea is. So this is Japan, and this is where the inland sea is. Here we have a larger map, so you can see this body of water separating the main island of Honshu, and then Kyushu in the south, and Shikoku here. And if you want, you sort of can think of the cities of Kobe, Hiroshima, and Kyushu lining the inland sea. So it really is a body of water that connects the Sea of Japan and the Pacific Ocean. In the Japanese, it's called the Seto Naikai. So in English, it technically is really called the Seto Inland Sea, but often just shortened to the Inland Sea. So the Inland Sea then is a poetic travelogue about Richie's explorations of the islands in that inland sea, and the travelogue records both his search for traces of old Japan, or real Japan, a traditional way of life. I put all these into quotation marks, and you'll see in a minute why, as well as his own journey of self-discovery. And what's really nice about this book is that throughout the book there are black and white photos by a very well-known Japanese photographer called Yoichi Midorikawa. If anybody is interested, you can find this book for very little money on Amazon used, or anywhere else at a used bookstore, and I strongly recommend it. I've only posted a few excerpts on iLearn. I have also posted a link to a movie of the same title, The Inland Sea, by filmmaker Lucille Carra. And this movie was filmed in 1992, 20 years after the publication of this book, and it sort of tried to retrace Richie's steps in a parallel journey that was very much inspired by that original travelogue. And in itself, it has become a classic, a cinematic classic. And what's really nice about it is it uses Richie's own narration, and the film manages to portray Japan's natural beauty, but also offers an intimate portrait of some of its inhabitants, very much like the original work. So I said on the syllabus, you can either read the extracts that I posted, or you can watch the film, or you can do both. You have to do one or the other. And a question that you might ask yourself is, to what degree does it mirror the elusive, and here again question mark, search of Richie, or Western travelers to the East in general. You remember that I put the real and the old into quotation marks. When we look at extracts from Richie's travelogue, you will see that there is something that might remind us of that exoticism of Hermann Hesse or Yasuno Akiko on their travels several decades earlier. So let's look at some excerpts. The ferry boat shudders. Of course, this is our last module. We have to talk about a boat, right? So, the ferry boat shudders. Whistles blow. People shout. A magical moment. One is seaborne. The distant city grows dim. A sudden sunstruck ground mist spreads out from the land but cannot catch us. The open sea is ahead, and from somewhere above comes the cry of a seabird. A long, lonely, piercing cry, different, far from the chirrupings of land. And then, as though in answer, a sailor in some corner of the ship, already hard at work, begins a song, a folk song perhaps, from the islands that I shall visit. I turn toward the sea. I don't care if I never come back. A journey is always also something of a flight. You go to reach, but you also go to escape. I'm going to see the islands and all that they seem to promise, but at the same time I'm going to escape the mainland and all that I already know it contains. I find less fault with Japan than with the century that is destroying this country, along with all the others. Now to escape is no sentimental gesture. It is survival. Anyone coming to Japan is, in a way, already escaping the worst, as glimpsed in other countries, mainly in America. But I have lived for a quarter of a century in Japan now, and have watched the growing blight whose traces might well be yet invisible to those coming from more fully corroded capitals. And it is not just the pollution, the smog, the death of forests and oceans that I seek to escape from. It is the future. In Japan, for the moment, the past still lives. But already in the larger cities, one is aware of the pressures of affluence and overpopulation, those twin ogres, one seemingly benign, the other already wrathful, that are killing the world. Along with too many people and too much money have come the ills that now afflict America, Europe, Japan alike. And while I can accept the crowds, the autos, the television, I cannot accept the diminution of humanity that follows, the sensationalism, the cynicism, the brutality. So the question is, what is he escaping from? And what is he trying to find? I think these are really interesting questions. And even though this was written in 1971, is this still relevant to us today? Does this still resonate? Let's see some other passages. The city was almost completely destroyed during the war, and when it was rebuilt, for once someone sat down and thought about how best to do it. While there are no outdoor cafes, no public places in which to sit down and read in comfort, that would be asking too much of the image Japan has of itself, there is at least a leisurely air about Takamatsu that reminds one of some provincial European city. So he is in Takamatsu. Maybe you can trace it on a map. It is elegant as well. The shops are well designed, smart. There are covered arcades in which no motor traffic is permitted. The city buildings are beautifully designed from the native stone, and there is more public art, murals, sculpture than I have ever seen in a Japanese city. The stores are equally modern, except for an occasional brick front left over from the Meiji period and hence fairly indestructible. And there are the coffee shops, great harbingers of modern culture. The role of the coffee shop in contemporary Japan should excite the interest of some social anthropologist. Here is where one first glimpses the foreign innovation that will shortly become Japanese. In the musical coffee shops, you first heard Schoenberg. In the artistic coffee shops, you first saw pictures of Giacometti. Here is also where I observed the first signs of the great innovation, the miniskirt. For years, the only place I could ever find the partisan review was in a coffee shop I used to frequent. Copies of the latest Vogue, the latest Evergreen Review, lie scattered in coffee shops all over Japan. There is no attempt at discrimination, but many of the pieces of various foreign culture are lying there, all brand new and ready to be put together like pieces of some giant and scattered puzzle. The Japanese coffee shop is the Japanese avant-garde. So you see, it's interesting, he's not only just looking for the past, he's also acknowledging the present, the avant-garde. So what is the real Japan, we might ask? And by the way, this section is from page 61 from our book, and I did not post this excerpt to iLearn. So if you want to read more from the middle of the book, again, I would recommend you pick up a cheap copy somewhere online. And one last passage, and this one is on iLearn. Kure, a city not far from Hiroshima. I awake cold. The sheet, too hot last night, is icy. I pull it over me and shiver. Then, thinking I must be ill, I sit up and look out the inn window. The sky is grey and white, a winter sky. I stand up and hang from the window. The green of the garden, only yesterday the tropical green of deep summer, is now greyish, as though covered with pumice. The tree trunks, yesterday a rainforest black, are now pale. The earth itself is no longer brown, it is tan, and a cool breeze stirs the bamboo as though it were January. Autumn has come with the appalling suddenness that it's its way in Japan. The long, hot, rainless summer is over, and it is over instantly. One morning it disappears. The leaves hang, and the sky in the middle of September looks like snow. Like evening in the tropics, autumn here is sudden, unequivocal. You wake up and have winter as though you were woke and had pneumonia. Those summer insects that sang beneath my window last night are now stretched on the underside of leaves, trying to escape from the cold earth with feeble claws. The lizards that ran yesterday among the rocks, the birds that panted with open beaks, the busy wasps reveling in the heat, all are still and cold now. I touch a mosquito on the shoji. It does not move. It is as though frozen. In my room, though, it is still summer, because there are my striped shirt, my bathing suit, my sunglasses, but they are no longer needed. I will have to discard them as though I had outgrown them, as though they were things left over from childhood. The mosquito does not know it, and may not live to see it, but in a week or so will begin the most miraculous of seasons, Indian summer. It is false and lovely, perhaps lovely because it is false, and it is the loveliest of all seasons in Japan, where for 2-3 weeks it is suddenly summer again, a deep summer with the sky an impossible blue and the sea the color of jade. It is one long and lovely respite before the winter. I mentioned earlier that this travelogue is also very poetic, and I think Donald Richie, with all his exoticism, with all his Western idealization of a Japanese past that might never have existed, he also is a very good observer, I think, what is truly beautiful about Japan. And that might remind us also of Huang Zunxian, right? Who amidst his search for Japanese modernity also had an eye for the cherry blossoms. All right, so as you approach the text or the movie or both, some questions to bear in mind. To what degree is the work a product of the language culture that produced it? And maybe more specific, how does the work fit into the context of post-war America? What kind of image does it project of the cultures or countries the writer is traveling to? Japan, of course, in this case. What drives Richie's desire to find the real or the lost Japan? How does this connect him to earlier travelers like Hermann Hesse or Yosano Akiko? What ultimately motivates the act of traveling? And more specific, why did an American intellectual travel to Japan in the post-war period? Why did Donald Richie write an account of what he saw and experienced? What kind of account? How does his work differ from readings of previous weeks in terms of focus, style, audience, mood? What can his work tell us about 1950s to 1970s Japan, America, the world? What kind of picture does he paint of the times, the people he encounters? And how do we, as 21st century travelers, react to Donald Richie's depiction of Japan and maybe the relationship between Japan and America? Well, I hope you have enjoyed our journey around the globe and that you will enjoy that last step on our journey. In our second course stream this week, I will introduce you to the final project and go over the outstanding assignments, so please tune in for that.